You think you can ruin my evening and walk away unscathed? Look at me when I'm speaking to you!
I didn't mean to, ma'am. Please, I swear it was an accident.
You call that carelessness and...
She froze when she heard the door open. The silver tray slipped from her hands, crashing against the marble floor. Standing there in disbelief was the man whose name built this mansion, the billionaire she called father. His eyes darted from her trembling hands to the maid's uniform she wore. Silence filled the room, heavy and cutting. How could his only daughter, his only black daughter, be working as a servant in her own home? What happened next would shake the foundations of privilege and pride forever. If this opening gripped, you comment your city below and hit like to keep these stories alive. It was a golden evening in the coastal city of Charleston, the kind of day that whispered wealth, calm, and order, where marble mansions stood like monuments to legacy. Inside one of them, Richard Halden, a billionaire investor known for his charm and precision, stepped off his private jet and inhaled, deeply, the scent of salt water mixing with the familiar aroma of polished oak and imported leather. After 3 weeks abroad, he was finally home. For most people, life in Richard's world was unimaginable. Yachts, galas, and a staff that moved silently through corridors wider than most apartments. Yet, beneath all the grandeur, Richard carried a quiet void. His wife had passed a decade earlier, leaving behind only one daughter, Amara. She was his pride, his reason for every empire he'd built. Adopted when she was just 2, Amara grew up shielded from the uglier truths of the world, surrounded by privilege, but never blind to how the world saw her dark skin amidst the pale faces of wealth. As Richard's car rolled past the gilded gates, the mansion looked unchanged. The fountains still danced, the lights glimmered, but something felt off. The staff moved more slowly, more quietly, almost hesitantly. He brushed it off as travel fatigue. Inside, echoes filled the vast hall. He called for Amara. No answer. The butler appeared, nervous, his eyes flickering toward the living room. Richard noticed the faint clink of dishes. He turned the corner, expecting to see a new maid. Instead, what he saw made his chest tighten. There, in a crisp uniform, head down and polishing silverware, was his daughter. His only child is working. For a moment, the world stopped. His mind refused to make sense of it. How could his own daughter, his heiress, be treated like help? In her own home? Something terrible had happened in his absence. He just didn't know what yet. And this was only the beginning. Richard stood frozen at the doorway. The sight of Amara in a maid's uniform slicing through the illusion of order that had always defined his home. The silver tray in her trembling. Hands clinked as she looked up, her eyes wide, startled, and heavy with shame. For a split second she tried to smile as if to reassure him, but it broke before it formed. The butler, pale and sweating, stammered something about temporary staff adjustments. Richard's voice was calm but dangerous. Staff adjustments. His words echoed through the marble hall. That's my daughter. The silence that followed was suffocating. The servants lowered their gazes. No one moved. Amara whispered softly, "Dad, please." Not now. Her tone wasn't defiance. It was fear. And that fear told Richard everything. He needed to know. Something had gone deeply wrong while he was away. As the hours unfolded, pieces of the truth began to surface. A new household manager had been appointed by one of Richard's senior executives, a man who modernized operations while Richard traveled. He'd quietly replaced staff, enforced strict roles, and insisted on professional appearance standards. Amara, returning home from a volunteer trip, had been mistaken for one of the new hires when she entered the house. The manager refused to believe she was the billionaire's daughter. Her protests had been dismissed. When she showed her ID, he called it fake. The staff, fearing they would lose their jobs, complied with his orders. For 2 humiliating days, Amara had been made to scrub floors and polish furniture, while her father's name adorned every wall of the estate. She had begged to explain herself, but each time she was silenced, reminded of her place. Oh, what burned most wasn't the labor. It was the looks, the quiet snickers, the whispers that told her she didn't belong. When Richard confronted the manager that evening, the man didn't apologize. Instead, he smirked, claiming he was just maintaining discipline, and that appearances matter in a household like this. His words carried that familiar poison, the kind that hides behind civility but cuts with centuries of prejudice. Amara watched from the corner, her eyes glistening but proud. She didn't want her father's wealth to erase what she'd endured. She wanted him to see, to understand that even in the safety of privilege, racism had found its way in. As the confrontation grew heated, the staff gathered, the air thick with tension. Richard's fists clenched, his composure crumbling. For the first time, he saw how blind he'd been to the quiet racism woven through the very world he'd built. Then came the words that would shatter what little peace remained. The manager sneered. "With all due respect, sir, if you didn't tell anyone she was yours, how were we supposed to know?" The room went still. Every gaze turned toward Amara. Every breath hung heavy. And in that moment, Richard realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror. A reflection of a world where his daughter's worth could vanish the moment he wasn't there to defend it. The storm was far from over. The air in the mansion cracked with silence. Richard stepped forward, his voice trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of something he'd never allowed himself to feel before, rage born of powerlessness. The manager stood smugly, flanked by 2 guards, his confidence rooted in the quiet belief that men like him would always be safe. But Richard wasn't the same man he had been that morning. He looked at his daughter, her hands raw from cleaning, her pride bruised, and something inside him broke. "You made my daughter scrub floors," he said, his voice low, steady, and deadly. "In her own home." The manager scoffed, muttering something about proper order. The words hit like gasoline on fire. Richard's voice rose, echoing through the grand hall as he fired him on the spot, the authority in his tone shaking even the walls. Guards hesitated, unsure whom to obey. Amara stepped between them, tears streaking her face. "Stop," she said softly. "He's not worth it." But her father could see how deep the humiliation had cut. No apology could erase what had been done. In that instant, the entire staff watched as Richard turned, not with vengeance, but with revelation. He had built empires, bought influence, commanded respect, yet none of it had shielded his daughter from being reduced to her skin. He realized then, money couldn't buy equality, and silence couldn't protect innocence. The mansion that once symbolized power now stood as evidence of something far darker. Dear audience, where are you watching from? Drop your city name in the comments. The following morning, the mansion was silent. No servants, no movement, just the echo of what had been exposed. Richard sat alone in the study, sunlight spilling across the polished mahogany desk. The uniform Amara had been forced to wear lay folded beside him, a painful reminder of how fragile dignity could be in a world still chained by perception. He had spent his life believing that success insulated him from society's cruelty. But now, that illusion had been stripped bare. His daughter's tears had shown him something no boardroom or speech ever could, that racism wasn't confined to the streets or the poor. It lived quietly in comfort, hidden in the smiles of those who claimed to serve. Amara, still quiet from the ordeal, joined him. She didn't speak of anger. She spoke of change. "We can't just fire them, Dad. We have to fix what let this happen." Her voice was soft but unshakable. Within weeks, Richard began transforming his empire, not just his home. He launched foundations for racial equity in corporate spaces, scholarships for marginalized youth, and training programs that forced those in power to confront their own biases. But beyond the public gestures, something deeper had shifted within him. For the first time, he understood what it meant to use privilege not as a shield, but as a weapon against injustice. The world saw a billionaire taking a stand. But for Richard, it was simpler than that. It was a father finally opening his eyes. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truths we often ignore. How many more moments like this before the world finally listens?